we are going to see and are seeing a bunch of jobs get automated in a shock-like way because people need to find ways, at least in the near future, to do things with less human contact between human beings. And we're seeing this moment that is a very deep reminder that people don't have control over their economic fortunes. That all of a sudden, a pandemic virus or something technological advance could happen in your industry that lays you off or that destroys the economy in your town. And so you really get into, I think, your argument now for UBI, which AI, coronavirus, like these things begin to almost operate as like metaphors for just a shock and what happens to people during a shock. And do you want to leave it up to Congress to argue about expanding UI benefits during a shock? So there's been a lot of movement actually in the Andrew Yang direction, or as I often like to think about it, the Annie Lowrey direction, towards just giving people money during this pandemic. And that's been a real policy shift. That is not how we've done things during past crises. So I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about why you think that's happened and what you think we can learn from its performance so far.
I am very happy for it to be the Annie Lowrey direction. And certainly, I'm thrilled about anyone who gets on board. Doesn't matter why or what you call it. You know that there are now dozens of mayors around the country who are championing guaranteed income. Michael Tubbs, the original, but there are now dozens of folks, Keisha Lance Bottoms, Eric Garcetti, and around the country who are committed to universal basic income pilots. And the reason, Ezra, is that now is just common sense, where you look around and you see that there are tens of millions of Americans who've gotten shoved out of the labor force because we don't need as many bartenders, airline attendants, security guards, ushers, personal trainers, you name it. Like there's so many jobs that required physical proximity that now just don't make sense. And like you said, it's not no one's fault. And so then you look around and say, how are we going to get economic resources into the hands of these millions of people? And cash relief is the only sensible solution. And $1,200 in April going out had a really positive effect on many households and on propping up our economy. But we need to make that regular, recurring, predictable. We've been living off of the first CARES Act. But then now that benefits have elapsed, you're going to see distress and disintegration pick up in many, many households and communities. And there really is no feasible way to help so many households manage this except for direct cash relief. And it's not just you, me, and Annie and Mayor Tubbs. At this point, last I saw 76% of Americans are pro-cash relief during the pandemic, and 55% are now pro-universal basic income. So it's no longer the magical Asian man making this case. It's the majority of Americans realize it's common sense and something we need to do.
So there's a big jump between using cash transfer for relief, which is what we've seen during the pandemic, and as you say, Republicans already moved into a stance of opposition on it, even though the pandemic is ongoing, and moving to a basic income floor. And right in the middle of that jump is this argument that Republicans are now making on the UI, on the unemployment insurance, why they won't extend the $600, which is that if people can get paid and can support themselves in their lives without working, they won't work. And the point of American economic policy should be getting as many people to work as we can, no matter what job they have to take. And so what is your argument to them? What is your argument to the Republicans who say, look, relief is fine, but we do not want to be paying people not to work because we want people working?
I would agree and say the last thing you want to do is tie economic relief to job status or employment status. So if you put cash into someone's hands and say you can have this cash unless you start working, then it actually is a detriment to them going back out there as quickly as possible in some cases. I mean, most people will still just be panicking until they find a job. And so to me, this effect is overstated and overblown. But to the extent it exists, you are right now tying a lot of this cash to employment status. I would say make the cash unconditional, and then you'll have a baseline. And if you go out and get that part-time job because it's not ready to be a full-time job because the bowling alley or the retail store is not at full reopening yet, then you get to keep that money, as opposed to right now saying, well, wait a minute, if I take this job, then I stop getting benefits. So the problem right now is our existing legacy infrastructure that ties the cash relief to not working.
Do you think the US government has a spending constraint on it? Could we do a UBI and a Green New Deal and Medicare for all and just put it on the national credit card, or do we have limited resources and we have to make choices between them?
Well, the argument I made on the trail, Ezra, which I sense you'd agree with, is that we have a revenue problem in that the biggest winners in the 21st century economy are paying zero or near zero in taxes very often. And the most prominent example is Amazon, the trillion-dollar company that paid zero in federal taxes last year. And so what I said to folks is like, look, if you have Amazon paying zero in taxes, you're going to have affordability problems for sure. And that if you harness the gains from the Amazons and Apples and Netflixes of the world, then you have a lot more revenue to work with very quickly. And then if you put that money into people's hands, that money does not disappear. It ends up going right back into the local economy in the form of car repairs and daycare expenses and the occasional meal out. And those businesses all then create more opportunities and can create virtuous cycles that help end up creating jobs and human well-being. But the big thing, Ezra, I think, is that we need to stop measuring our economy in terms of these narrow economic outputs, where if you try to figure out what's good for us by what's good for the stock market, then you're lost. And so if we
Wait. But I'm going to hold you on. I'm going to hold you on this argument before you go into it, because I want to stay on I'm not measuring our economy by narrow economic outputs by GDP right here. The question I'm asking is
can we afford it? I know.
Do we need to pay for? Yeah, do we need to pay for things like this? And what I would say is, I know the corporate tax data on this stuff, well enough to say that the list of things I just gave you, Medicare for All, UBI, and Green New Deal, you could do everything that the folks I know who want to tax corporations and rich people quite a bit more think we should do. And in most cases, I want to do those things too. And you wouldn't come near paying for this set of things. So at some point you have to. There is a question of whether or not these things are worth raising taxes for, which I often think they are, but taxes are a hard sell. And then there's a question which you will sometimes hear people who associate with modern monetary theory and other things arguing, which is that maybe we don't need to raise taxes for them. Now, a lot of MMTers would say you can't do things this big without raising taxes because you'll get inflation. So that's an argument as well. But that's my question for you. Like, do we need to figure out how to pay for it? Because if we have to figure out how to pay for it, then it's going to be it's going to force more choices and more sequencing.
I agree with everything you just said, Ezra. And I also have seen the math. And I know the price tags on some of the things we're talking about. But one of the things I said to folks on the trail was, what is the cost of not addressing climate change? Or what would the cost of climate change be if we just let it wreak havoc and ravage our country? And then people reflect on that for a second. Most of them don't know, the size of the economy pre-pandemic was 22 trillion or so. So if I throw that in there, then they say, well, climate change is going to cost us trillions of dollars and thousands of human lives if we were to do nothing. And so then you start thinking, okay, the cost of inaction is in the trillions. So then what is the benefit of our investing in climate change mitigation? Particularly if you start measuring how we're doing based upon how we are actually doing as human beings. Like if you have a group of people drinking unclean water or having their town submerged, that might not show up in certain economic indicators, but it ought to. So the way I'd answer your question is to say that we should not be thinking we can just do everything under the sun in terms of putting it on the government's bottom line, but we can be much, much more aggressive than we currently are about making large-scale investments in our own future, in our infrastructure, addressing climate change, and putting universal basic income into our hands. Because in many cases, a lot of these investments will end up paying us back in both human ways and economic ways. And the argument I'd make on the trail was that if you have universal basic income in people's hands, does that improve our educational outcomes? Does that improve our health outcomes? Does that reduce the cost of incarceration? Does that improve the ability of ex-convicts, their ability to reintegrate into society. Like there are many, many things that we spend a ton of money on right now that we could reallocate or alleviate if we invested directly in our people. And that was what a lot of people were missing oftentimes, is that the investments you and I are describing actually pay off, and in many cases pay for themselves. Thank you for listening in. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you did, please do subscribe to Yang Speaks and click on notifications so we can let you know every time we have a new episode.